Alright, hi guys. Last video for the week, so April 9, 2020. We're going to be covering two key concepts today. So 2.1 is the Silk Road. I went ahead and added some information about the Mediterranean sea routes as well because the content doesn't explicitly cover it. Next week we're going to cover Indian Ocean and Trans-Sahara, and so this one was kind of left out, and it's important to know some of the information, so I kept it kind of short. And then the other one is going to be about the Mongol Empire. Tomorrow, technically, there are should be no classes. It's considered a bad weather holiday, but technically it's Good Friday, which makes it this week is Holy Week, and so there's no school tomorrow officially. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the Silk Road. It was formally established during the Han Dynasty of China. What it did is that it linked regions of the ancient world in commerce, which is another word for trade, or business, between 130 BCE all the way up to 1453 CE. And it marks about 1453 CE because that's going to be pretty much the fall of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottomans are going to go in and take over, and then there's a whole bunch of chaos that's going to ensue, but that's a little bit later on. The Silk Road is made famous by Marco Polo. So Marco Polo was a European traveler. He was from Italy, actually. And he would travel along these trade routes to Asia, and then he would record all of these details of his excursions, his journeys, things that he saw, things that he did, the different cultures, the different people, languages, everything. He just documented all of it down in these really long descriptive books, manuscripts, and then would have them printed off to Europe, and then people in Europe would get really excited about reading them because these were foreign places that they never heard or seen about, and then it encouraged them to kind of want to trade and go out and voyage out for themselves. And so Marco Polo is shown there in the picture, and then of course the famous game Marco Polo, Marco Polo. All right, I'm going to move myself really quickly. So what you see on the map is basically the version of the Silk Road. So it's an actual road, sort of. There's a land route that is in orange that you see, and it connects pretty much almost all the way Eurasia to parts of further Asia. I said Eurasia because of Turkey and the fact that Turkey is so close to Europe. So it's really, really, really close. Again, the city of Constantinople is important because it has easy access to the Mediterranean trade routes as well. And then the red routes that you guys see are going to be the water routes, the maritime routes. All the major dots that you guys see are big port cities in this territory or in this area. And then these would have probably been used more for bulk items because boats can carry way more things than animals or even pack animals or camels or horses and things like that. And so if you were carrying large quantity items, you would have used the maritime routes because it would have just been easier to transport these very large items. Okay, so some of the things that were transported from west to east, so from Europe to Asia. Horses, saddles, the grapevine, grapes from Mediterranean area, dogs and other exotic animals, domestic and not so domestic, so wild animals, if you will, animal furs, skins, honey, fruits, glassware, woolen blankets, rugs, carpets, and other textiles such as curtains, so anything that's pretty much made by hand, gold, silver, camels, slaves, and weapons and armor. So on the picture you can actually see early European explorers traveling via the land routes, and it shows kind of like a mini caravan, if you will, because they do have some camels that are with them. They're traveling on horses along this ancient trade route. This one I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, probably because the most valuable goods actually came from east to west, so they actually went from China to Europe. Things like silk, tea, dyes, precious stones, porcelain, spices, bronze, gold, medicine, perfumes, ivory, rice, paper, and gunpowder. So let's start first with silk. The picture that you guys see there, which shows a man and a woman standing by a mulberry tree, and you see these little things kind of hanging off the tree. Those are actually silkworm cocoons. The process for extracting silk was extremely secret and extremely guarded. The Chinese would have a monopoly on the silk trade for hundreds of years. Monopoly meaning they were the ones that controlled it all. And silk was an extremely valuable resource, luxury item. It was an item for the wealthy, for the rich, for the powerful, for kings and queens, and sometimes even the priests, depending on the religion. So it is an article of clothing that is worn, but the process for making silk, like I said, it was very, very secret. So there's a way to extract the silk from these silkworms, and then there's a way for women to then, have it spun into fabric or thread, or to be able to make garments and clothing. And that was a secret that was very, very well kept for a long, long time until the Europeans would pretty much steal it from the Chinese. Spices, believe it or not, some cultures, some areas would go to war for spices because the Europeans didn't have these exotic spices for their food. And so it was something that was wanted or craved by these other groups and cultures. And so sometimes, yes, there were spice wars. Sounds funny. The other one is going to be the gunpowder. So the Chinese are actually going to be the ones to create an early version of gunpowder first, and it was actually used for fireworks. It would later be used by Islamic empires, the gunpowder empires, which we'll talk about also later, and it's going to be a very valuable tool in terms of warfare for other cultures. So some interactions that occurred between several peoples and several groups. The Han Dynasty of China, which lasted from about 202 BCE to 220 CE. So don't think that was only like 18 years. Look at the time period. It's BCE, so before the Common Era all the way up to the Common Era. So it is a couple of hundred years that this dynasty did rule China. They were constantly being harassed by nomadic tribes to the north of them and to the west of them, known as the Xiongnu. So what ended up happening is that in 138 BCE, Emperor Wu had sent a missionary / emissary known as Zhang Qian to help ask for help from the west. Zhang Qian would go on these expeditions or on these travels, and so the picture of him in the middle is him going on one of these journeys, and it would actually put him into contact with groups of different peoples from different cultures. Probably the most important culture that he came into contact with happens to be a group known as the Dayuan people, or also known as the Great Ionians, and I'll talk about them in a minute. These people were from Central Asia. They have sort of different names. So they're known as the Dayuan people, but they're also known as Great Ionians. Ionian, if it sounds familiar, it's actually Grecian in its origin. That is because the people that lived in this area are classified as Greco-Bactrians. Greco meaning Greek. They are descendants of the generals and the peoples and the blending and the cultures of Alexander's great army. So when Alexander the Great, again, going way, way, way back, when he conquered all these parts of the world, he left a lot of his generals behind. The generals married the women from the area. They began intermixing and creating a whole new kind of race or culture of people. And so these people have a mixture of Greek and Asian heritage. The Dayuan had a specific type of breed of horses, mighty horses. And Zhang Qian thought that he could report back to the Emperor Wu, and these horses could then be employed effectively against the marauding Xiongnu. So I'll show you on the next slide, but the horses in Asia at this time were really, really small. They were short to the ground. They were kind of more furry because Asia has a lot of steeps, and so the horses have to be kind of low to the ground. It's something that is unique to this area. And so the horses that you normally picture are probably these larger Western European horses. The horses that I'm going to show you right now are not what they originally had. So they originally had, oops, wrong side. Whoops, sorry. The legacy of the Silk Road. Hold on. I think I probably messed it up, so I'm going to just keep going, and I don't want to stop myself. So I'll just keep going. But the legacy of the Silk Road basically is that it was an exchange of culture, art, religion, philosophy, technology, language, science, and architecture. So all of these different peoples are bringing everything with them, their knowledge, their experience, their culture, and it's being traded along these very specific stopping points. So if you look here on the map, you'll see certain objects that stand out, glassware, metalwork, textiles, oils, tea, sugar, spices, other things like that. And it was basically known to all travelers that were going up and down this road that these were where you could find these items, or these luxury items. Okay, so the Mediterranean sea trade. Oh, I know why. So I'm trying to think of why I'm thinking about the horses. The horses are going to be moving it to the Mongols, so I'll show you that in a minute. My bad. Okay, so the Mediterranean sea trade was better suited, like I said, for the heavier, bulky items. Things like wine, olive oil, and grain were main components of this network. Things also like timber, marble, glassware, perfume, silver, spices, and silk. So lots of goods. On the map that you guys see there, you'll notice that it says the commercial network of the Phoenicians. That's because most of the trading groups on this area were either from Phoenicia, the peoples of Phoenicia, or the Greek peninsula, so the territories that are around the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians would actually establish a network of colonies that reached across the region. So everything that you see in those red lines is the Phoenician trade routes. They would also even reach as far as northern Africa. The city of Carthage, what we talked about when we talked about Rome. Remember, they're the ones that planted salt because they were like really, really upset. That's the area that eventually the Phoenicians would conquer as well before the Romans. Greeks became involved because they needed grain. So we also talked about them as far as agriculture goes. Their agriculture wasn't that great. They had enough, but not a surplus, and so they still needed to reach out to other cultures to make sure that they did have adequate amounts of food for their people. So they would exchange grain for things that they had in excess of, which was wine and olive oil, which helped also spread the Greek language or the Hellenistic culture, language, architecture all across the Mediterranean. The most significant change in terms of Mediterranean sea trade is going to come when Rome would actually conquer that city of Carthage that I talked about in northern Africa. Because what essentially is going to happen is that Rome is going to create this huge, giant empire for itself that reaches across all of this territory. And then I also mentioned their legal system. They're going to enforce their uniform, consistent legal system, which basically becomes international code, international law for all these territories that kind of go under their belt. Language, as far as it was used along these trade routes, tended to be Latin, because that is a language that was spoken by the Romans, and so it actually helped facilitate trade or make trade easier. Piracy was handled by the Roman Navy, and so I put pictures of two different ships there. The warship would have had the red sails. The merchant ship would have had the orange sails, so it's easier to see or differentiate between the two. And so the Roman Navy would take care of controlling those issues of piracy or any kind of crimes on the water. The Romans actually referred to the Mediterranean Sea as Mare Nostrum, which basically means our sea, and that's pretty indicative of how the Romans viewed things, everything was theirs. Romans depended also on massive grain imports to be able to feed their urban centers. Most of their grain came from Egypt, and they needed it to be able to feed their people. They also did import silk to meet the demands of the upper class, as well as things like copper, tin, glass, wine, and olive oil from other parts of the cultures in this area. Okay, so now we get to the Mongols. The Mongols of Central Asia marched across much of Eurasia throughout the 13th century, leaving destruction and chaos in their way. The reputation of the Mongols for slaughter spread even farther than their actual conquest. That is because people like to talk, and so the stories and the legends of this group of people would live long throughout history. However, in their quest for blood and treasure, the Mongols also sparked a period of interregional connection and exchange at a level that the world had not experienced or seen for about 1,000 years. That is because even though these Mongols are viewed and depicted oftentimes as these, bloodthirsty barbarians on horses who are extremely skilled and really good warriors, like I said, they were also pretty religiously tolerant. They wanted security, they wanted stability, they wanted to create a long-lasting dynasty, and so even though there are a lot of negative things surrounding them, there are also a lot of positive things to make note and mention as well. So the Mongols and their surroundings, where do they originally come from? Who are they? Where did they pop up? So in the 12th century, the Mongols are actually a group of multiple clans, and they're pastoral nomads. So they also have to follow the animals and they have to move around depending on the resources in their area. They're located mostly near the Gobi Desert, which if you look on the map borders between the countries of Mongolia and China. So they do kind of straddle this border between the two areas or the territories. Most of the area where the Mongols are from is known as the Asian Steppes. It's very, very harsh. It's mountainous. It's arid. So it's very, very dry. Stuff doesn't grow. And so they do have to constantly move to be able to find resources to support their families, to support their clans. The Mongols are unique in that they expected everyone to become skilled horse riders. The horse was very influential or key to the evolution and the creation of their societies, and so therefore they expected males and females to be able to be skilled riders, not just the men. They were also held to the same standards. Everyone kind of had to participate in the hunting and gathering parts, and they really valued courage in hunting and in warfare. So they were also surrounded by other tribes that they didn't always get along with. Groups like the Tartars, the Naimans, the Merkits, and the Jurchen, who are eventually going to form the Qin dynasty, which we'll talk about in a minute. the Mongols began to covet the wealth of other tribes. They wanted to establish themselves as kind of being the more dominant, more powerful group, and therefore they also wanted access to the luxury items that were available via the Silk Road. Things like the silk, obviously itself, but also the gold and the jewelry as well. And the picture you guys can see there, you have what is depicted as a Mongol warrior using the short bow. They had to be very, very skilled on horseback with the bow. Which is pretty hard. I've never done it myself, obviously, but it's a multitasking skill, if you will. One of the most famous leaders, if not the most famous leader of the Mongols, undeniably, I guess you can kind of say, is Genghis Khan. So he was originally born Temujin in 1162. He spent a lot of his early life creating tribal alliances and helping defeat neighboring groups one by one. He formed very key friendships, and he married his oldest son to the daughter of a neighboring Khan, which is another name for king. Temujin was extremely focused on building power. He also was known for being very ruthless. So one story tells him that he even killed his own stepbrother. He wasn't afraid to execute family if need be, which also was important because he appointed members of the clan or the group that were not family members. Most of these groups, these early clans, would rely heavily on family or extended family, and Temujin instead valued more skill, loyalty, and competence, I guess you can say, how well off somebody was. And so if that person was more valuable than a family member, the job went to that person, not just a family member because that guy is related to you or something like that. Personal loyalty was the best way to run his growing kingdom, is how he felt. So in 1206, Temujin actually gathered all of the Mongol chieftains together, and they had this meeting known as the Kurultai. At the Kurultai, he basically kind of sits down and tells them, so are you going to make me king of kings? Or what? Like, what's going to happen? And because of his reputation already at that point, all the rest of the Khans are essentially scared of him and basically say, yeah, that's what we're going to do. So he officially becomes the Khan of Khans, if you will, and changes his name to Genghis, which means ruler of all. So he goes on to conquest, goes on to claim more territories to add to his growing empire, and he attacks the powerful Jin Empire. So these are the Jurchens. The Jurchens were one of these tribes that were located to the north of them. They would take over and control parts of northern China, which included Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, and they had created like an early version of a dynasty. Their capital was Zhongdu, which is present-day Beijing, and essentially Genghis Khan and his army annihilate them. They take them over. This is where he earns his reputation as being an extremely terrifying warrior during this campaign, because anybody who resisted him was brutally killed in terms of retribution. You want to stand against me? Fine, you're going to die. That was the message that he sent to his enemies. Sometimes the Mongols would even wipe out entire civilian populations after defeating the armies. And this is considered a big no-no at the time. So you have an army, you're fighting another army, and the war is over. Okay, that's it. It's done. They lost. You're the winners. Okay, point taken. Genghis would make it a point to also execute and kill the civilians as well. These are your common people, your farmers, your peasants, anybody who necessarily didn't even have a role to play in the fighting was therefore also butchered because they were just on that side as well. So people did have to be very, very careful. Stories continued to spread of his ruthlessness, and sometimes before a war had even started with another neighboring group, the army of that other group that was going to be attacked by the Mongols would end up surrendering because they were afraid of another situation like this popping up again. And so rumors quickly spread of his brutality. He would then go on to conquer different parts of the Islamic world as well. So he conquers the Karakitai Empire and the Islamic Khawarizm parts of these territories also. So he started out in where you kind of see the star a little bit more to the left. It's a city known as Karakorum, which will eventually become the Mongol capital. And he establishes what he calls a khanate, which is another way of saying a kingdom. Eventually his kingdom, which I'll show you on the next slide, is going to reach all the way from the North China Sea and to eastern Persia. So everything that you see on this map right here, these are different territories of his different khanates. So you're going to see the khanate of the Golden Horde, you see the khanate of the Great Khan, you see the khanate in the middle, which happens to be called the Chagatai Khanate, and then you see the Purple Khanate, which is the Il Khanate, which is Persia. He controlled all of it. Later, much later, it is going to be split up amongst his descendants, because when he passes away, there is going to be some issues, which we will talk about right now. At war, Genghis created a very long-lasting legacy for himself. So his soldiers were extremely skilled. They were fearsome. They were proficient with a short bow. So that's a depiction of what a Mongol warrior would have looked like at the time. They're extremely disciplined, which means they know how to behave and obey. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you didn't obey or behave the way they expected you to, you died. That was the consequence. That was the punishment. And so you don't want to die, and so you are going to follow commands and you are going to follow rules. He also did two interesting things with his military. He created a messenger force, which is kind of like a Pony Express, if you will. These guys were expected to ride for days on end on these horses. They would even sleep on these horses to deliver messages. And the messages were oral. So if the messenger, was captured, he was expected to kill himself before he could be tortured to deliver the message. So the messages were only by word of mouth. He also developed these special units of soldiers that were, it was their job to go out and map out the terrain. So creating really descriptive maps that, I'm getting jumbled in my thoughts because I'm thinking of the word topographic, but I could be wrong, where it basically maps out like mountainous areas, plains areas, where there's water, where there's steeps, where there's maybe a secret, way for them to go through. It was their job to be able to make sure that if they were going to plan an attack or a battle, they knew exactly all the standpoints that the enemy could attack from. And so they had to be very, very skilled in terms of geography or mapping out these places for further references. He also established a pretty rigid structure in terms of order and conduct, as far as like a hierarchy. So one soldier was grouped into a group of 10 soldiers. These 10 soldiers were known as an arban. Then 10 groups of 10 soldiers were grouped into a yegun. And then 10 groups of these 10 soldiers were grouped into a mingan. And then, as you guys can tell, obviously from there, those 10 of 10 of 10 of 10 of 10 are grouped into a tumen. So everybody had a very specific leader to follow, and everybody knew the expectations that were set forth for them. The picture that I put up there actually shows one of the sieges that the Mongols are famous for, because the Mongols were actually famous for their siege warfare, and they were one of the first ones to actually use biological warfare as well. They used to put dead bodies of plague victims on these catapults and then throw them over into the city. So if you were living in a fortress or in a walled city, and if you thought, oh, okay, I'll be safe if I just put my walls up and, pull the drawbridge up, we'll be good in here. No. The Mongols would throw the dead bodies over into the city and then basically infect the city from the inside out. Genghis also at war, he would use a tactic, which basically what he would do is that he would have a smaller group of soldiers attack initially, and then it would make it look like the other guys were winning. So the small group of soldiers would sound a retreat bell, like, okay, we lost, we have to leave. The enemy would kind of get this boost in ego and get really, really excited and maybe even start chasing after the small group of soldiers. And then right along a hill or a ridge, there'd be a larger army waiting for them. And so it was kind of like a shock to them because they weren't expecting this to happen. And so it would confuse, and they could then outflank the rest of their enemies. Another thing that Genghis was famous for is that when he would ask for surrender for a city, if the enemy refused, the first people he would kill was all the aristocrats. Aristocrats are the wealthy people, the people who are in very high positions of power. Then he would go to the craft workers, the miners, and others with skills, trades, or anybody that also had the ability to read and write, and he would recruit them to work for the Mongol Empire. That word recruit is loosely used because their option was come work for me or die. So the majority of these people went to go work for Genghis Khan because they had a valuable skill. He'd kill the aristocrats because they have no skill. Their only skill is that they have money, so he kills them and takes all their money. Other laborers were used for carrying materials back to the front line or then used later as soldiers. So you can actually see one of these guys surrendering to Genghis Khan up there. I mentioned the siege weapons already, so when he would recruit these people to come and work for him, he would also recruit engineers, people who were skilled at building things, especially people from China and Persia. And then he wanted them to basically build bigger and better, more efficient weapons. So things like portable towers. The tower that you guys see over here on the right-hand side, left-hand side, depending on which way you're looking at it, is known as a Heliopolis. Heliopolis, excuse me. It's actually Greek in its origin, but the Persians adopted a version of it later, and then other cultures would adopt different versions of it also. So it's a different tiers or different levels. You can attack the city from different areas. And then the other one is a version of the catapult. You can put people or things or items on it and then projectile launch them over something. They would hurl really, really large objects. Even though Genghis earns a reputation for being pretty ruthless, pretty brutal in warfare and battle, and he definitely deserves it, he also is famous for establishing a very long-lasting period of peace. So between the 13th and 14th centuries, a period of peace is known as the Pax Mongolica. Once he's done conquering, once he's done taking over all the territories that he needs to, he has no need to continue any further, and so it's a period known as the Mongolian Peace. He establishes his capital at Karakorum. Like I mentioned, there's a picture of what it supposedly looked like today, which is now near the modern-day country of Mongolia. He consulted with other scholars and engineers of Chinese and Islamic traditions to create probably the most bridges out of any other ruler in the history of the world. Genghis at peace also was famous for some of the social policies that he instituted, including a very strong policy of religious tolerance. He really wanted to welcome people into the kingdom, Christians, Jews, other types of missionaries. He himself was not a religious person, but he did want, or he was intrigued by all of these different cultures and religions. So he encouraged them to come to his areas, and they were free to practice as they wanted. He also did a good job of employing the soldiers once the fighting was done. So some other empires like the Romans, when you have war constantly and these soldiers have a constant steady paycheck, that's a good thing. When the war is over and these soldiers have nothing to do, they become unemployed, and they can sometimes be a nuisance on society because they're restless, they don't have a job, they can't provide for their families. Genghis did not want that same idea or tradition to happen, and so he actually employed the soldiers continuously and gave them a new task. So instead of going to war, their new job is now to protect the Silk Road, which is actually really, really smart, because if they had soldiers along the Silk Road protecting it, it also meant that people felt a lot more safe being able to travel to this area. So think of like modern day when you have like checkpoints and you have areas where people stop and they ask you, for papers or your citizenship or other questions or where you're traveling. This is basically what the soldiers did, and it also helped cut down on banditry and crimes happening along the road. He also tried to unify the empire somewhat. So even though he was tolerant of a lot of other cultures and religions and people, he wanted to try and adopt one unified language to help represent the Mongol culture. And he adopted the Uyghur language, or the alphabet, to kind of help do that. Because of the prosperity from all of these things, it did mean that new trade channels were established between Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And anybody that managed to survive and not die from either diseases or warfare benefited obviously greatly from this trade. When Genghis dies, he dies while fighting. He dies fighting another group known as the Tanjuts south in the Gobi Desert. He did not choose his firstborn son to be his next in line. He actually chose his third born son, which happened to be his favorite son. His name was Ogedei. Ogedei still also has to go before the same kind of council that Genghis Khan went before, the Kurultai, to be elected, officially chosen as Khan of Khans. And he is kind of without hesitation, since he was directly chosen by Genghis. It's kind of like a formality. So he's elected the new emperor of the Mongols. He was also very, very skilled in terms of military leadership, but obviously he didn't compare with his father. He does continue to expand. He makes roads inland. He conquers modern-day parts of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. parts of the Indus River Valley, southern China, as well as invading Korea in the 1200s. He was really focused more on establishing a long-lasting empire in Karakoram. So yes, he wanted to expand, yes, he wanted to add to the empire, but he really wanted to stabilize what the Mongols already had. So he wanted to create a more efficient bureaucracy, he wanted the capital to become more prosperous, he wanted to create more permanent buildings, rather than having the typical Mongol yurts. So the yurts were like those circular hut type of areas that the Mongols originally lived in. Remember, they were nomads, and he didn't want that for his people anymore. He wanted a stable living area. Okay, we're done. Whoa, go back. Sorry. So, no assignment today, just the video. However, I did want to give you guys a chance to earn some extra credit. So tomorrow, Ms. Kantu had sent out a calendar via Remind for autism awareness. It's Superhero Day tomorrow. So if you send me a picture of yourself wearing a superhero shirt, you get extra credit. You can either text it to my phone number. It's on the calendar in Google Classroom. I'm not going to say it out loud because if you have access, you have access. You guys know my number. Or you can email it me at apwh.aisamora@gmail.com. And then quick shout out to Adeli Tapia for being the first one yesterday to comment on the video over Western Europe. So awesome. See you guys later. Have a good weekend. Happy Easter. Be safe. Stay safe. And email me, call me if you guys have any questions. Bye.